the mid-1980s, 5 mafia families run the city of New York. Through their control over construction, transportation, and the labor unions, they use extortion and violence to dominate the city's economy. For years, the authorities have battled against them with limited success. But now, the US government prepared to deliver what they hope will be a death blow. The plan is bold, but simple. To cut off the head of the mafia snake by taking direct aim at the men who rule New York. Men like the Colombo family boss, Carmine Persico. Head of the Gambino crime family, Paul Castellano. Lucchese godfather, Antonio Dux Carallo. And Fat Tony Salerno, leader of the powerful Genovese family. Together they form the governing body for the entire US Mafia, known as the Commission. The task of sending these men down falls to attorney Rudolph Giuliani, the man who would one day become mayor of New York City. Giuliani believes that taking out the bosses will effectively destroy organized crime in the city.
Giuliani indicted the heads of all 5 New York City crime families, which was, completely unprecedented and unheard of.
Giuliani and his team order the 5 mafia bosses to be brought in. It's the boldest move ever taken against the US Mafia.
Once and for all, the government was saying that in New York City, organized crime exists, and these are the leaders of the 5 organized crime families. So the prosecution was significant and garnered a lot of publicity and press at the time.
As they prepare for their courtroom showdown with the mob, the government knows that the stakes couldn't be higher.
Until then, virtually most mob bosses were immune from prosecution. The higher-ups didn't do any real acts. They didn't pull a trigger. They didn't stab anybody. They didn't shake anybody down.
Giuliani's challenge now is to make sure he secures his convictions. He has a powerful weapon on his side, the 1972 Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO. RICO is key legislation designed to catch the big fish that until now have always managed to wriggle free.
But the key to the RICO law was if you were a member of an enterprise and a leader of an enterprise, you could be convicted and sentenced to 30 to 50 years.
By using the RICO Act, the government no longer need to prove these top mobsters are guilty of a specific crime. Just proving they are in charge of the mafia will be enough to send them down as part of a mass criminal conspiracy. Giuliani and his team use years of FBI surveillance and witness testimony as evidence against the bosses. And eventually their strategy pays off. On November 19th, 1986, a jury finds the bosses guilty of mass criminal conspiracy.
This is a great day for law enforcement, but this is a bad day, probably the worst, for the mafia.
In a stunning victory for the government, the bosses are each sentenced to 100 years behind bars.
They proved the effectiveness of the RICO law.
This was a big prosecution where everybody was going to do a big amount of jail time, and the government scored a clean sweep.
With one bold move, the authorities have taken out the entire leadership of the New York Mafia. Or so they think. Leading the celebrations of the squads of the FBI's Special Mafia Task Force. These 5 squads have been on the front line in the war against organized crime. One of its key agents is John Pritchard.
Each squad would go after a particular family. The family that I was assigned to supervise the investigation of was, in fact, the Genovese crime family.
The Genovese squad's target had been the star defendant in the commission trial, Fat Tony Salerno. Despite the apparent success of the FBI's Genovese squad, Pritchard isn't in the mood to celebrate. Something about the commission trial is troubling him. He has long harbored doubts about Salerno's ability to head up the Genovese family.
Fat Tony Salerno was viewed and believed to be the head of the Genovese crime family. But you have to understand, at that point, it was just theory.
To Pritchard, the comical-looking Salerno never seemed to display any of the attributes of a top mafia boss. And he's starting to suspect that the Genovese squad may have just sent down the wrong man. It's a remarkable suspicion. If Pritchard is right, that means the real Genovese boss is still at large. As law enforcement continues to celebrate their victory over the mafia, intelligence comes in which adds to Pritchard's suspicion that Fat Tony Salerno is the wrong guy. Across town, Vincent Cafaro, Tony Salerno's supposed right-hand man, is facing a racketeering charge. In an attempt to strike a deal with his interrogators, Cafaro decides to reveal some remarkable information. He dramatically confesses to investigators that Fat Tony Salerno was never the boss of the Genovese family. According to Cafaro, Salerno was never anything more than a stooge.
That was a ruse to throw us off the track of ultimately who was in fact the leader of the family.
So just who is the real boss? The person Cafaro now names takes the investigators completely by surprise. It's someone they would never have suspected.
He told him that the real leader of the family, and had been the leader for years, was Vincent Gigante.
But for years, the FBI had viewed Vincent Gigante as a bumbling madman.
He wandered around the city in his pajamas sometimes, acting strangely and bizarrely.
He would do things like speak with the parking meters, urinate in public.
How could anyone think that this person would be the head of the most powerful mobster family in America?
Agent Pritchard wonders whether Gigante could actually have hoaxed the entire bureau. If true, the squad's biggest success against the Genovese family in convicting Tony Salerno could now be their greatest humiliation. If true, Gigante is now the most powerful mob boss in America. Could this shuffling madman really have played them all for fools? For Agent John Pritchard, one thing is clear. If he's going to set the record straight, he has a massive task before him. He's going to have to convince the entire city that this madman is in fact a ruthless mob boss.
I believe that Gigante was far more powerful than necessarily than he had been given credit for.
Now, an insider claims that this bumbling madman could have pulled off one of the greatest scams in criminal history. To expose it, Agent Pritchard realizes he and his team will have to start by re-examining every piece of intelligence the Bureau holds on Gigante.
That historical information, that was used as to bring people up to speed in terms of who this guy really was.
Pritchard discovers that Gigante first came to the attention of the FBI in 1957. Only in his 20s, he was given the contract to kill rival crime boss Frank Costello, head of the Lucchese family. But Gigante's assassination attempt failed.
You would think that that kind of high-profile failure would doom your career. But in Gigante's case, it really didn't seem to have that effect.
Gigante quickly rose through the ranks of the new Genovese family, and by the early 60s had reached the rank of capo. This was a senior position within the family, putting him in command of his own crew. In the mid-60s, just as Gigante became a contender for a senior position in the family, he mysteriously falls off the radar.
They had really no file on Gigante from like 66, which is kind of crazy when you consider that even at that point, he was a well-known guy.
For some reason, the FBI's attention shifted to Fat Tony Salerno. Something dramatic had happened, but what? When Pritchard examines the FBI's earlier investigation into the Genovese mob, he discovers a report that could explain everything. Back in 1981, the FBI decided to use Gigante as the unwitting bait for a tactic called tickling the wires. Tickling means provoking the mob and then listening out for chatter that might incriminate them. And one of the mobsters the squad targeted was Vincent Gigante. They decide to issue him a subpoena to see how other members of the Genovese family react. But when the agents turn up at Gigante's home, the investigation stops in its tracks.
The agents get inside, they go through the apartment, and they go to the bathroom where they hear the shower running, and they open the door, and there's Vincent Gigante.
Nude under the shower holding an umbrella. I mean, you know, that that story went around the New York office quite a bit. You know, it was very humorous.
It's suddenly clear to Agent Pritchard why Gigante dropped off the Bureau's radar.
For the most part, the concept or the theory the FBI had that he was a little bit of a daffy guy, but he was really not that important.
After the shower incident, the FBI stops pursuing Gigante. Could the head of the Genovese family have been faking? Agent Pritchard worries that Gigante may have been misdirecting the FBI for years. Pritchard turns his attention to FBI surveillance reports and the unofficial Genovese HQ, the Triangle Social Club in Lower Manhattan.
The Genovese family would congregate there pretty much every day and play cards and appear to be socializing.
One of the first things they were trying to do is identify the people in the Genovese family and who was who.
Over the years, the squad employed a variety of methods to put pressure on the Genovese mobsters to break cover. Agents openly patrolled outside the Triangle Club, writing down the license plates of every car. And in full view of the mobsters, put the bar under constant surveillance.
And they would just have someone there with a camera taking pictures of who came in and out. And by doing that, they could figure out who the hierarchy was.
And throughout the FBI's surveillance, Agent Pritchard discovers that Vincent Gigante stuck to the same routine.
If you're doing FBI surveillance, you're going to see every day on Sullivan Street, Vincent Gigante going from his apartment to the social club. Once he gets there, you're going to see a procession of the family's top capos coming in and going out, back and forth.
And although the so-called lunatic was frequently observed wandering the streets around the club with high-ranking mobsters, despite their best efforts, the FBI failed to record any conversations.
The Genovese guys, they're a very close-knit and closed-mouthed group. And they didn't have a lot of success.
The squad's surveillance teams concluded that Gigante was harmless, a relic from a previous era tolerated by the real bosses. Everything Pritchard reads suggests the FBI ignored Gigante, believing he was little more than an ex-mobster with dementia. For all intents and purposes, he appears to be mentally ill, incapable of crossing the road, let alone running $1 million criminal empire. But Pritchard can't let go of his hunch. What if Gigante is the proverbial wolf in sheep's clothing? The very fact that he continued to move in mob circles was surely suspicious.
There's no question about it. I mean, if you're in the mafia and you're crazy, really crazy, you're not going to last in the mafia, not at all.
Agent Pritchard decides to go back to square one. It's time to start surveillance of his own. For decades, Gigante has been thought of as a bit player, but now Pritchard decides to give him the attention he deserves.
They were very intent on doing what had not been done in a long time, which was to get Vincent Gigante indicted in a courtroom.
This time, the squad keeps their presence discreet, secretly setting up round-the-clock surveillance of the Triangle Club. It isn't long before Agent Pritchard sees evidence that his hunch about Gigante is right.
I was participating in a surveillance one night and saw him with the usual ratty bathrobe that he wore. And all of a sudden, he had taken off the bathrobe and he had a very well-tailored sharkskin suit on.
It just further cemented for him that they were after the right guy.
Because it just showed me, or convinced me, that whole thing was an act.
It's the moment Pritchard has been waiting for. Now he presses the button on a new investigation into Gigante.
He had this great fear of going to jail, of being prosecuted.
But Pritchard needs more than a hunch. He has to prove Gigante's mental illness is a deception. He returns to the case files. He eventually comes across a report from 1970. It reveals the very moment that Gigante came up with the idea for his perfect cover.
He was accused of bribing, it sounds crazy, but bribing the entire police force of a New Jersey town that he lived in. Which, you know, he didn't consider to be anything more than kind of a gesture of goodwill.
But local prosecutors decide to make a case against him. And trapped in a corner, Gigante tries something extraordinary. He checks himself into a hospital and convinces psychiatrists he is schizophrenic.
His lawyer came to court and said, my client is mentally unwell and he's actually in a mental hospital. This is 1969, 1970. The idea of an insanity defense really hadn't been broached anywhere.
He was cunning, and he saw a dodge that he took, or attempted to take, to get out from under the thumb.
Gigante's strategy works. At trial, he's acquitted of all charges. And over the next decade, Gigante meticulously embellishes his role, building a convincing picture of a mentally disturbed man a tactic that was paying dividends.
There's a developing sense that hey, this is not a bad way to approach these things. And he decided to go big with it.
Every couple of months, he would go in for what was known as a tune-up. He would actually check into a mental clinic.
It became almost like a vacation. Like if I would go to Disney World, he would go to the St. Vincent's Mental Hospital.
The orchestrated visits give Gigante virtual immunity from prosecution. So he takes the idea further. Taking the charade out onto the streets, it takes him out of the FBI's firing line. Gigante plays the harmless old man among a family of killers. And for decades, the shuffling old man act appears to dupe the FBI. But now, Agent John Pritchard has to find a way to expose Gigante as the fraud he suspects he is. First, he has to blow the crazy act wide open, and then prove he's the real boss of the murderous Genovese family. Pritchard pours more resources into his investigation. He increases surveillance on Gigante and targets his known associates. It only needs one conversation to reveal him as the real boss, and he immediately becomes responsible for every crime carried out by his organization.
We were going after people that we felt could draw Gigante into a conspiracy involving a RICO case. And in fact, that was the emphasis. We knew that eventually, if we kept after him, that we would be able to show that he, in fact, was the leadership of the family.
The squad now has growing evidence that behind his act, Gigante is sane. But lacking anything concrete, the team are in danger of losing momentum. But if he ever needed convincing, Pritchard discovers just how important his investigation was. In January 1986, two of his detectives, Anthony Vendetti and Kathy Burke, are on a routine surveillance operation. They're watching one of Gigante's mobsters.
A fellow by the name of Fritzy Gianovelli. Fritzy was a capo that answered to Gigante. It was a routine surveillance, and it wasn't one that, you would think was be particularly dangerous.
When their shift ends, the detectives head home. But they've been spotted by their mark. And unknown to them, they're now being followed. The detectives decide to stop for a coffee. Vendetti heads into the diner, while Burke waits for him in the car. Giovanelli and his crew decide to strike. Burke spots the danger and tries to stop them. But she's not quick enough. The mobsters shoot her. Then Vendetti. Burke is seriously wounded. And tragically, Tony Vendetti lies dead.
It was emotional for me because I had lost a friend, a detective that worked for me on the squad.
Agent Pritchard's investigation just got personal, and he decides it's time to enter the lion's den.
Knowing that Gigante was the head of the family, he took on far more importance because of their shooting. Myself and another agent went to interview him at the Triangle Club.
Gigante is ordered to step outside. And according to Pritchard, when confronted about the shooting, completely drops his act.
He saw that we were serious, and he was very lucid. There was no doubt in my mind, having this conversation with him, that he was as sane as I am.
Back at the squad's HQ, Pritchard gathers his team. The shooting means bringing Gigante to justice is more urgent than ever. It's now clear their target isn't just sane, he's dangerous. So far, though, the squad has failed to get any tangible evidence against Gigante. And now he's been inside the Triangle Club, Pritchard knows why.
I'm probably one of the few agents that have been inside the Triangle Social Club. There was a sign up on the wall over the payphone that this location is bugged. You know, don't say anything in here that's criminal. They actually had that written on the wall.
It's clear that wherever Gigante is doing his business, it isn't at the Triangle Club. The boss must have another secret HQ. The squad decide to escalate their surveillance. And eventually, they get a break.
As the FBI increased its surveillance of the Chin, they came to realize that Sullivan Street was not the be-all and end-all of kind of his existence as they initially thought.
Every evening at the same time, Gigante is picked up by a driver from his mother's apartment building on Sullivan Street. And he doesn't reappear until the next morning. So where does he go? Pritchard's team focus their efforts on following Gigante's car. Tailing him is easier said than done, because wherever he's going, he doesn't want to be followed. For weeks, Gigante's drivers expertly navigate the city's streets, shaking off any FBI tails. The squad don't give up. And eventually, they discover where Gigante has been hiding.
They finally traced him to a home on the east side.
We realized that it was being used as a place for him to hang his hat, if you will.
The apartment belongs to Gigante's mistress, Olympia Esposito. It's a well-chosen location, making a clear line of sight for Pritchard's surveillance teams difficult. But they find a safe position on the roof of a local school.
One of the agents on the squad really did a Herculean job in terms of, at night, all sorts of weather, crawling out on this ledge to observe what was going on within Gigante's residence.
Over the next 4 months, the agent painstakingly records Gigante's behavior inside the apartment. And at last, they have visual evidence that Gigante isn't mad.
They could see how well dressed he was, how he acted normally, how people came, he had conferences.
He actually had people there for meetings. We saw him in conversation at the table. We observed him, counting money and things like that.
What the FBI saw confirmed everything that they had believed. That this was a mob boss. He was not a mental patient.
To prove Gigante is the Genovese boss in a courtroom, they need him on tape. So far, the mobster has no idea the squad are onto him. Pritchard now knows just how paranoid Gigante is. Any mistake they make could blow the entire investigation, and months of work will go down the drain. To reduce the risk of discovery, Pritchard decides to use some expert help.
It was a really rare opportunity for the FBI to have recordings of this guy. And they brought in a FBI specialist who had this special drill, and it was supposed to go just so far into the wall, and then it would sense where the other side was and stop.
Unfortunately, the installation of the device didn't go particularly well, and in fact, it was discovered. We tried things that were unique, and sometimes they worked and sometimes they didn't.
The botched attempt to install the bug tips off Gigante. He immediately resorts to his tried and tested fallback plan and books himself into a mental institution. With Gigante's deception successfully resurrected, the Oddfather believes he is safe. But Pritchard's investigation will yet come back to haunt the great illusionist.
A lot of stuff that was developed over the years just doesn't die. It sits there as evidence. So eventually, some prosecutor or some agent down the road is going to be able to use that earlier evidence.
2 years later, lawyer Greg O'Connell picks up where Pritchard left off. His challenge is to prove on the record that Gigante is sane and in charge. But O'Connell has found a way to succeed where Pritchard's squad had failed. He's managed to get a Genovese associate to cooperate with his investigation.
The investigation into Vincent Gigante grew out of a federal organized crime narcotics investigation, where we placed the wiretaps on a couple of significant organized crime players.
O'Connell's investigation quickly exposes a major drugs ring trafficking heroin and cocaine in the heart of the city. Armed with damning evidence, the authorities quickly shut down the narcotics operation, arresting its members. They're big players in the New York Mafia. And O'Connell discovers that one of them might be able to give him something which has eluded the FBI for decades. Direct access into Gigante's inner circle. Bobby Faranga is a Genovese family associate. But facing life imprisonment, he's also the ideal candidate for O'Connell to turn informer. So his investigators now turn on the pressure.
He decided to cooperate. And he opened our eyes to a world well beyond the narcotics investigation that we were conducting.
Investigators discover that Faranga's involvement in a major narcotics ring didn't end there. He's also carried out far more sinister tasks on behalf of the Genovese mob, helping get rid of their competition.
Some of his buddies were knocking off, these were mob wannabes or low-level mob guys. They were committing murders, and they needed a place to dispose of the bodies.
Faranga knew where the remains of several homicide victims were, and that evidence enabled us to actually conduct digs, exhume remains, verify the identities of the victims.
All these victims have been disposed of on business premises and warehouses belonging to the Genovese. And Faranga reveals that all these locations are all owned by the same person. It's a lead which blows the case wide open.
It turned out that he was a guy who was on record directly with Vincent Gigante.
It's a huge break in the case. Faced with Faranga's statement, O'Connell's latest suspect also decides to cooperate with the investigation and testify that Vincent Gigante is the Genovese boss. His informer's name is Peter Savino.
I would look at that as the milestone event. Peter Savino were directly on record with Vincent Gigante. He had met with Gigante on dozens and dozens of occasions. So Savino was absolutely critical to our investigation. We had him wired up against numerous organized crime figures in New York for a year and a half.
The RICO Act means O'Connell doesn't need direct evidence to put Gigante away. He only needs to link him to a conspiracy. And thanks to Savino, he thinks he's found a way. Throughout the 1980s, the 5 mafia families formed a cartel to muscle in on one of New York's biggest maintenance contracts. Replacing windows in the city's housing projects generates over $170 million for the mafia. And the man chosen by Gigante to represent the Genovese family's interests is Peter Savino.
Peter Savino was a major earner for the crime family. He was a guy that knew how to make money. But because Savino was the Genovese crime family representative in the window replacement business, that gave us a focus for our extortion charges.
Savino agrees to testify that Gigante is a key member of the Windows cartel, proving beyond doubt that Gigante is capable of running a complicated criminal scam. O'Connell feels this case is solid enough to put Gigante in front of a jury. On May the 30th, 1990, the authorities make their move. Gigante is arrested. As he's led into court, prosecutors know he will play the insanity card for everything it's worth. But stalling the trial is something O'Connell and his team can't afford.
The real key to it was Peter Savino. And Savino, by this time, was dying of cancer.
If Savino dies before he has a chance to testify, the case against Gigante crumbles.
Gigante kept up his usual ruse, muttering to himself, sometimes looking with his head down as a hangdog, looking around, paying no attention to what was going on.
Gigante tries to convince the court that he's schizophrenic and unfit to stand trial. It works. The case is on the verge of collapse, but this time they're prepared. They've got a second witness to testify to Gigante's sanity. And now they play their trump card. A secret star witness, Sammy the Bull Gravano. As former underboss of the Gambino family, Gravano had meetings with Gigante. And in March 1996, he testifies that on those occasions, the Genovese crime boss had been perfectly lucid.
He was able to describe in a very meaningful and impactful way the role that Gigante played in his own organized crime life.
Gigante is declared competent to stand trial by the judge, and O'Connell and his team have the green light to present their case. It includes more than 250 exhibits, including much of the evidence from Pritchard's investigation.
Having an FBI agent sit on the witness stand and testify in great detail about the normal nature of his second life was really crippling to the defense.
It's now time for Peter Savino to put the nail in the coffin for the prosecution. Terminally ill with cancer, Savino is unable to attend the trial in person, so he testifies via CCTV from his secret location on the Witness Protection Program. It's a devastating blow for Gigante's lawyers.
If a defense attorney could pick the most difficult person to challenge in terms of credibility, it would be somebody dying of cancer from testifying from his deathbed.
Despite his pain, Savino makes it through the cross-examination. And on July 25th, 1997, Gigante is found guilty on 8 counts of racketeering and conspiracy, and being godfather of the Genovese family.
Gigante would have died in his own bed if it hadn't been for Peter Savino. His evidence was devastating.
Sentenced to 15 years behind bars, Gigante's health starts to decline, this time for real. And with the writing on the wall, he finally drops his guard.
He decided to lighten up. And he was chit-chatting with the nurses, acting normally, and looking to enjoy his remaining days. And when news of this came out, that he had shed his act, the Eastern District U.S. Attorney's Office decided to indict him again on obstruction of justice.
On December the 19th, 2005, Vincent Gigante dies, age 77. For over 2 decades, his cat-and-mouse game with the authorities kept him one step ahead of justice, allowing him to retain absolute power over the New York Mafia and govern his criminal empire with impunity.
Inside the Mafia, the most respected, feared, cunning, and tyrannical leader was Vincent Chin Gigante. No question about it.
Gigante's elaborate charade failed to last, and thanks to the stubborn pursuit of investigators like John Pritchard, the odd father of organized crime is finally taken down.
There are 2 decades of efforts by some of the best FBI agents that we had that ultimately succeeded in taking him down off his throne.
He engendered so much fear in people because if you made a mistake, that would be enough for him to eliminate you. I feel personally good that we were able to take Gigante and take him down.
In 1981, Joe Massino, head of the Bonanno crime family, is taking out a contract on a close family member who's destroyed his trust. One of his lieutenants, Sonny Black Neapolitano, is responsible for one of the worst breaches of secrecy in the history of organized crime. Joe Massino makes sure he pays the ultimate price.
Sonny Black was taken to a house in Staten Island, was pushed into the basement, and was killed and shot several times, and he knew what was happening. His last words were, "If you're gonna do it, make it good."
Sonny Black's mistake had been to fall for the cover story of Special Agent Joe Pistone, posing undercover as a low-life diamond thief called Donnie Brasco.
Donnie Brasco was the stage name for Special Agent Joseph Pistone of the FBI. Pistone penetrated the Bonanno crime family by posing as Donnie Brasco, a sort of two-bit thief, guy who dealt in stolen property and jewels and ingratiated himself with the crime family.
Sonny Black was the most senior member to fall for the ruse. And for a remarkable period of 6 years, he allowed Donnie Brasco access to many of the Bonanno family's dirtiest secrets.
He gathered tremendous intelligence information by just being able to transfer what he was learning to his contacts in the FBI. He was a phenomenal asset for the FBI.
Sonny Black and Brasco became close friends. Sonny Black even recommends Brasco for induction into the Bonanno family as a made man.
Napolitano had taken Pistone in almost as one of his right-hand men, and he wanted him to be inducted as a made soldier.
An infiltration this deep and for this long is unheard of in the history of New York's crime families.
The idea that an FBI agent could infiltrate and almost become a made member was unbelievable.
Massino knows that Donnie Brasco's inside knowledge is potentially disastrous and could bring down his highly secretive Bonanno organization. This disaster rests squarely on Sonny Black's shoulders.
This was an unbelievable sin.
Joe Massino had built a successful family on the foundations of secrecy and loyalty. By trusting Pistone and letting him get so close, Sonny Black had undone everything. But the message doesn't stop there. Massino next orders the death of the man who introduced Brasco to Sonny Black, Anthony Mira. To drive home the point that loyalty to the Mafia is more important than blood, he orders the execution to be carried out by Mira's own cousin.
There was a cleaning of the house, as it were, for the Bonanno crime family. Indication of how ruthless and businesslike Massino could be.
But the damage has already been done. Brasco's information takes down the Bonanno family, including its boss. Joe Massino is convicted for racketeering and sentenced to 10 years in jail.
Pistone's infiltration almost completely destroyed the Bonanno family. It led to scores of indictments, scores of prosecutions, scores of convictions.
Worse for Massino. The information Brasco learned inside the Bonanno family leads to the indictment of 50 other mobsters, including senior members of New York's other 4 mafia families. The Bonanno family, built on a reputation of watertight secrecy, is leaking like a sieve.
The repercussions of the revelation that Donnie Brasco had infiltrated the family were staggering. The other 4 families treated the Bonannos like they were radioactive.
The Mafia's governing body, called the Commission, cut the Bonannos out of all their syndicated rackets. It's a devastating blow to Massino. His reputation and his family's multi-million-dollar income are in the gutter.
The Bonanno families were looked upon as undesirables by everybody else in the New York and national mafia. Nobody wanted to deal with them anymore. They were so untrustworthy.
For the FBI to wipe out the Bonanno family so completely is a triumph. FBI agent Pat Colgan was on the Bonanno squad.
It was very satisfying for law enforcement to see the convictions come in.
They had gambling, they had extortion, they had loan sharking. The feds did a really big job in decimating the crime family.
Yet there was one big fish that eluded their net. Somehow, Massino's second-in-command, Salvatore Vitale, had escaped indictment and is still on the outside. Suspecting that Vitale is still engaged in criminal activities, the FBI stake out his HQ. Over a period of weeks, the feds record enough evidence of racketeering to convict several members of Vitale's crew. But once again, the FBI falls short of catching Vitale. Jack Stubing, who headed the team, remembers it well.
We indicted several members and associates of the Bonanno family, but Sal Vitale wasn't one of them. Vitale was not caught in the act of committing any criminal acts, and so he was never indicted as part of that investigation.
But with Joe Massino and his top men behind bars, with or without Vitale, it looks like the Bonanno family is finished. So the FBI shuts the Bonanno squad down and reassigns agents to go after the bosses of the other 4 mafia families.
Law enforcement has limited resources. They can only address so many problems at the same time.
Although Joe Massino is locked up, he's determined not to be stopped and begins rebuilding his family and his reputation.
Joe was still effectively the head of the Bonanno organized crime family, even though he was in jail.
After Donnie Brasco's devastating infiltration of the family, loyalty is more important than ever. So he chooses Sal Vitale to represent him on the outside, the one man he knows he can rely on implicitly.
Massino and Vitali were brothers-in-law, and they had a very close relationship growing up because of their close familial ties.
And as Massino's brother-in-law, Sal Vitali is allowed to visit his boss.
Vitali was a very trusted member of Massino's inner circle.
Joe Massino and Sal Vitali were the best of friends. Joe Massino trusted Sal Vitali to the nth degree, no question about it.
In effect, prison visits become mob meetings.
Sal Vitali was definitely running the Bonanno organized crime family at Joe Massino's request.
Taking directions directly from his godfather, slowly but surely, Vitali starts rebuilding Massino's empire. But it isn't easy. The exclusion of Bonanno's family from large syndicated mafia rackets hits profits hard. Vitali has to start again.
The Bonannos, not being represented on the commission anymore, were forced to look into other things.
They increasingly turn to dealing hard drugs to raise cash.
There were always crews in the Bonanno family that were involved in narcotics trafficking, but they became a little more blatant about it.
As drug use surges, it becomes a multi-million-dollar business. And the Bonanno family cash in. Their rebirth blindsides the FBI, who by now are focused on taking down the other 4 mafia families.
There's very limited intelligence on the Bonanno family while Joe Massino was in jail.
The FBI lost contact and really had no information about the Bonanno family.
With their attention diverted elsewhere, the FBI have no idea that when he is eventually released, Massino will be more powerful than ever. And in a shocking twist, it will be Donnie Brasco that he'll have to thank for it. In November 1992, at the end of his racketeering sentence, Joseph Massino is released from prison. As far as the FBI are concerned, the crime boss is a has-been. But thanks to Sal Vitali, Massino is once again the boss of a thriving Bonanno crime family. Despite prison, the 2 men have made the organization stronger than ever.
Joe Massino brought them back into stardom. They became probably the most important family in New York.
And all the while, the FBI has been completely unaware of Massino's expanding empire.
We had very poor informant coverage.
With Massino now on the outside, it isn't long before the FBI hear rumors that he's back running the show. Realizing their mistake, Jack Stubin reopens investigations into Bonanno activities, gathering as much new intelligence as he can.
Massino was the key to the family, so what I had to do was find the key to Massino.
Stubing's squad focus not on Massino, but on his soldiers, looking for a weakness.
One of the things that I've always preached is that you don't go head on for the main guy. You start probing around for who the weak spots are around him. Because the guy who's at the top of the pyramid got there because he's got his wits about him. And so you're looking for somebody who's maybe not so sharp.
But Stubing's squad get nowhere. It seems Massino has learned a valuable lesson. It's no good hoping for loyalty. You have to ensure it. Bonanno soldiers are terrified to say a word against him.
No one would talk to us about Joe Massino because they feared him. He was feared absolutely because he was a violent man and his reputation preceded him. Joe Massino threatened people with death.
Despite round-the-clock surveillance of Massino's HQ, Stubing finds it impossible to get anything useful.
He built these protective walls.
He communicated face to face. He was very selective in who he did meet. He wouldn't just meet Tom, Dick, and Harry off the street. He had to know them or be assured by somebody else that this was a trusted person.
Massino was cagey and canny, so he wasn't going to make some sort of stupid mistake to get caught.
He would walk around the block. He would put his hands over his lips to avoid any type of recording that a lip reader could possibly translate.
He knew about bugging and wiretapping, and in that sense, nobody really spoke on the phone.
With his surveillance and wiretaps failing, Stubing decides to put his own life in danger.
I decided to go out and visit him at his business and see what he was all about. He had a catering business out on Long Island called King Caterers, which was responsible for what were known as roach coaches, these trucks that visit construction sites and sell sandwiches and coffee to workers. And his trucks reportedly also provided services such as loan shark loans and taking bets.
Turning up unannounced, Stubing heads inside. He has no idea how the unpredictable and sometimes brutal crime boss might react.
He was back in the kitchen making sauce or something. And I engaged him in conversation, and the approach that I had taken was that, you know, I know you're trying to go straight and you're not in the life anymore and that kind of thing. And he knew I didn't believe it, and he didn't believe I believed it. But it gave us the opportunity to have a conversation because as much as I wanted to see what he was all about, he wanted to see what I was all about and what I knew.
Stubing realizes that Massino's men have been watching his agents as much as his agents have been watching Massino.
During that conversation, he told me about his different experiences with the FBI, and he told me about surveillances that he had been the subject of. I'd been on some of those surveillances. He could physically describe agents. He knew what cars we drove. He had partial license plate numbers. He knew pretty much everything that was in our bag of tricks up to that time in investigating organized crime and what had been successful and what hadn't been successful. It was clear that he was somebody that had his wits about him and was a master of his craft.
Stubing may have looked his enemy in the eye, but the result is that Massino now has the measure of Stubing, and the crime boss tightens his security even further.
He abolished the idea that they would meet in social clubs, easy places to infiltrate and to conduct surveillances by the FBI.
Massino saw the social clubs as being a liability because they gave the FBI a forum for which they could sit out outside the social club and photograph everybody going in.
With the FBI getting nothing and his soldiers remaining loyal and silent, Massino's crime empire continues to expand.
They got no significant surveillance of Joe Massino at all in those investigations.
Stubing may be getting nowhere with Massino, but FBI investigations into the other families are reaping rewards as lawyers prepare for what becomes known as the commission trials. These trials prove participation in huge syndicated rackets worth tens of millions of dollars, and the bosses of all 4 of the other New York Mafia families are sent to prison. It's a devastating blow for the Mafia, but for Joe Massino, it clears the field. He's the last man standing, and the FBI nickname him the Last Don.
Joe Massino was considered the last Don because he was really the last of the old guard. He was the only significant player left on the street.
Thanks to Donnie Brasco, the Mafia Commission banned the Bonannos from its syndicated rackets and saved Massino from the later indictments. Brasco and the feds have practically given Massino the entire underworld to himself.
In a way, Pistone did the Bonanno crime family a favor because the impact was to shield the family from involvement in any of the other major mafia rackets because the family was shunned.
What Pistone did indirectly, he took the spotlight for years, almost a decade, off the Bonanno family.
By the mid-1990s, there is still a complete wall of silence surrounding Massino's soldiers. To the FBI, the last Don seems untouchable. But then Jack Stubing gets lucky. A secret informant squeals, not on Massino, but his loyal number 2, Sal Vitale. It's the breakthrough they've been waiting for. The source isn't from within Massino's operation, but from someone associated to it. He tells them that Sal Vitale has been using a bank in Long Island to launder cash and to extort gambling and loan sharking debts. As regular customers went in the front of the building to do their normal banking business, round the back, Sal Vitale worked over his own late payers.
He basically turned it into the personal bank of Sal Vitale.
The FBI moves fast, indicting Vitale along with 6 of his associates and the bank's manager for racketeering. Although Jack Stubing can't tie the illegal activities to Joe Massino, they do put Vitale behind bars. But inexplicably, Vitale gets an unusually short prison sentence. When the Bonannos hear the news, there's nervousness.
Vitale's trouble with the bank case on Long Island was something that created suspicion among other members of the crime family that Sal might be cooperating because he got a relatively light sentence.
Gripped by paranoia, Massino doesn't know what to do next. Vitale would be more dangerous than Donnie Brasco. So dangerous that Massino even considers having his brother-in-law killed. While Vitale's life hangs in the balance, Massino cuts Vitale out of the family.
Joe began to view Sal with a little bit of suspicion. He became a liability, and Joe, put him on the shelf, as it were. Took away his rackets and took away his earning power.
Knowing how one rat quickly becomes many, Massino looks for anyone else in his organization who might pose a threat.
Massino had that brutal side to him. He could be very ruthless. He could be ruthless to protect himself. He could be ruthless in policing the crime family.
One glaring weak link is Galando Sciascia.
Sasha was a pretty significant captain out of the Canadian wing of the Bonanno family.
Many years earlier, Sciascia had murdered 3 men on Massino's orders. But recently, Sciascia has become powerful and showing signs of becoming greedy. In the wrong hands, knowledge of the murders could do Massino a lot of damage. Massino doesn't hesitate. He has him killed too. Massino's crackdown works. Stubing's investigation draws nothing but blanks.
I became convinced more than ever that he knew so much about how we operated that we were going to have to try something that we hadn't tried before. He was certainly well aware of our surveillance techniques. and it was time for a new approach.
So Stubing turns to history for inspiration. In the 1930s, Detective Elliot Ness followed Al Capone's money trail. Capone's accounts turned out to be his Achilles heel. Could the same approach work with Massino? Stubing drafts in two young agents, Jeffrey Sallet and Kimberly McCaffrey, specialists in forensic accounting.
The FBI has always actively recruited accountants, but they've used them primarily for white-collar investigations. It seemed to me that if we could pry a couple of accountants loose from the white-collar program, maybe we would be able to uncover things that we hadn't uncovered before.
This was something that had not been applied in the modern fight against organized crime. Beautiful part about money is the trail never leaves. So time is on our side when it comes to investigating the finances.
Sallet and McCaffrey get straight to work and subpoena Joe Massino's accountant to get his financial records dating back 10 years.
The great part about accountants is they save everything. They save bank records, they save credit card statements. So we subpoenaed any and all documents related to Massino, Vitale, or any of their corporations that were listed in their names.
It was a lot of paper. We were dealing with a lot of spreadsheets. Basically, we're looking for a needle in a haystack. It was actually really fun. I don't want to say we're a little bit nerdy at times, but I love records. It was like putting together a puzzle.
Although it's laborious, Sallet and McCaffrey examine every single document, line by line by line.
The way that we view financial documents at the time was that every piece of information in there was intelligence. There is a story behind every transaction. If you take a bank statement and you cut off the numbers, you have a series of leads.
It isn't long before something unusual catches their eye.
Massino and his wife won the New York State Lottery to the tune of about $500,000 over a period of 5 years. So they won 4 out of 5 years. Those transactions, we viewed them as suspicious. It would be highly unlikely that somebody would have the luck to win the lottery to that extent.
Sallet and McCaffrey figure out the scam. Massino has lottery sellers on his payroll. They leak the names of winners before they make a claim, and Massino buys the tickets off them at face value and then claims the prize for himself. Dirty drug money becomes legit.
It was a red flag that they were laundering their money. And Joe Massino has a way of legitimizing some of his ill-gotten gains.
It's a valuable insight into the workings of the family, but it's not enough.
That wasn't what we were after.
Sallet and McCaffrey step up their search for something incriminating in Massino's financial records. Line by line, they continue their forensic investigation, but it's not easy.
It can be very tedious work, and we really didn't have the kind of computerization and resources that we take for granted nowadays.
But they notice a series of checks, each made out for $25,000 to a Barry Weinberg.
The first question Jeff and I both had at the time was, who is Barry Weinberg?
Putting Weinberg under investigation, they discover that he's a wealthy entrepreneur and the owner of several Manhattan parking lots.
What we eventually figured out was most parking lots in New York City are, you don't actually own the property, you own the lease. And the leases are very valuable.
And they're especially valuable to Joe Massino. By leasing Weinberg's parking lots, Massino can create false parking receipts, a perfect way to account for the mountain of cash flooding in from drugs and other illegal activities.
So that's what the checks were for, to, again, legitimize income for him.
Could Weinberg be Massino's Achilles heel? If the FBI apply pressure on the shady businessman, he might divulge valuable information on the crime boss.
Weinberg was a very nervous guy. We did not think that he would be capable of spending any time in jail, and we figured if we arrested him that he would cooperate with us and give us an inside look into the Bonanno organized crime family.
We knew that Barry Weinberg might be someone who we could get to work for us.
Sallet and McCaffrey subpoena Weinberg's IRS returns. They discover that although he's earning millions of dollars each year, he pays hardly any tax. It's exactly what they need for leverage.
Barry Weinberg had evaded about $14 million in taxes, so we knew there was some good motivation for him to cooperate with us.
Fearful of alerting anyone close to Massino that they're onto Weinberg, Sallet and McCaffrey go for a low-profile arrest.
The NYPD pulled him over. They pulled him out of the car. We pulled up in a van next to the car. The van's door opened. Weinberg is hustled in, and we have Weinberg in the back seat, and he is with myself and my partner, where we say to him, Mr. Weinberg, you have 15 minutes to make a life decision. We can either bring you down to the Eastern District of New York and process you for your tax evasion, or you can wear a wire and work for us right now.
Fortunately for us, he was ready to cooperate.
We debriefed him, and then after we sent him right back out on the street with a wire on.
Weinberg knows that if his wire is discovered, he's a dead man. But over the coming months, he records over 100 incriminating conversations. The tapes lead to racketeering charges against 20 mobsters, but the most important is one of Massino's closest henchmen, Frank Copper. Already in prison for a 5-year sentence for stock fraud, Copper realizes these charges could put 20 years on his sentence. He tells the feds he's ready to flip. It's the first time one of Massino's soldiers has been prepared to break his code of silence. FBI agents Sallet and McCaffrey can't believe their luck. Copper doesn't hold back. After years of evading the FBI, the last Don now faces a mortal threat. Copper confesses to killing Sonny Black Neapolitano and to the fact that his murder was commissioned by Joe Massino himself.
We were all fairly blown away because we did not know that he was going to come in and talk about that.
It's enough to finally move on Massino. And on January 9th, 2003, Sallet and McCaffrey raced to arrest him.
We were concerned that if we did not act quickly, he would flee.
We were taking down a crime boss that, many had considered untouchable.
It was really, culmination of a lot of effort, blood, sweat, and tears. We went to the front door. Kim and I went first. We knock on the front door. And there's Joe.
Incredibly, Massino is expecting them.
And he says, "You must be Kimberly, you must be Jeffrey. I've been waiting for you."
Sallet and McCaffrey throw on the cuffs. After an investigation lasting years, the last Don is finally in custody.
It was huge news at the time. His reputation was that he was an untouchable crime boss.
We weren't looking for Joe to talk when we arrested him. We were looking to put him in jail. He was at the top of the food chain.
With Massino behind bars awaiting trial, Stubing works to ensure that the case against him is watertight. He sends Sallet and McCaffrey to see Sal Vitale, hoping they can convince him to flip like Frank Copper.
Vitale was a person who literally knew where the bodies were buried, and he would be able to provide very, very important intelligence to specific crimes and to future plans that Massino may have had for the family.
With Vitali working so closely with Massino for so long, Salet and McCaffrey know his testimony would be damning.
We said to him, we'd like you to cooperate with us, see the four walls that you're surrounded by. This is what you're going to look at for the rest of your life.
Massino's closest ally holds to the code of silence and refuses to say a word. But Salet and McCaffrey have an ace up their sleeve and reveal to Vitali that Massino had previously wanted him dead, believing he'd cooperated with the feds.
We have with us the detention memo that was written by our prosecutor. And in that, it talked about how Massino wanted to kill Vitali. He says, prove it to me. And my partner Kim looks him in the eye and says, we don't have to prove it to you. You know it's true. And he shakes his head up and down and he says, yeah, I do. I do know it's true.
With that, Vitali decides to flip. What he tells them is nothing short of devastating.
Sal was involved in orchestrating 11 murders for the family.
Other crimes include extortion, gambling, loan sharking, narcotics. Incredibly, Vitali lists every crime that he and Massino had ever been involved in.
Sal Vitali destroyed the Bonanno family when he decided to talk.
On May 24th, 2004, the trial against Joe Massino begins. The list of accusations against him is overwhelming. 11 counts of conspiracy, 16 racketeering charges, extortion, gambling, loan sharking, and 7 homicides, including the murder of Sonny Black Neapolitano. Despite all his efforts to enforce secrecy with the Bonanno family, 7 of Massino's closest confidants testify against him. But the prosecution's star witness is his own brother-in-law, Sal Vitali.
Sal's testimony was devastating. I mean, it was the case was airtight on Massino.
Sal Vitali's testifying was an extraordinary moment in that trial. Vitali knew so much that it really was curtains for Joe, and it was an amazing betrayal.
The evidence is completely overwhelming, and Massino is found guilty on every count.
There's no question Sal Vitali's testimony was totally responsible for Massino's conviction.
Massino had outwitted FBI investigations for decades. Jack Stubin takes satisfaction in the fact that his team laid the groundwork for his eventual conviction.
When Massino was convicted, I took a personal pride in the fact that the team that I had originally assembled had been successful in carrying this forward, and I was very proud of how they had wrapped the case up.
On the day that Massino was convicted, we felt like we did our jobs. We had agents from back in the 1980s that called us and were like, thank you. Like, they had surveilled him for so long. They had wiretaps, they had all different kinds of things in various social clubs back in the 80s, and they could never get him.
For Massino, things were about to get even worse. But the feds know it's not over, and fearful that Massino might continue to run his family's operations from behind bars, they pull a trump card and hit him again, this time with the ultimate punishment. Even before the ink is dry on his verdict sheet, he's served for yet another murder, which this time threatens to send him to the electric chair.
Joe Massino was the first official boss to face the death penalty.
He was charged with the 1999 murder of George Gerlando Sasha, who had been kind of the liaison between the Montreal faction of the Bonanno family and the New York faction of the Bonanno family.
Threatened by Siachia's emerging power, Massino had had him killed. But in 1994, Congress had passed a law which meant that a conviction for homicide in aid of racketeering could be punished with the death penalty. Suddenly, the stakes for Massino get much, much higher.
Joe Massino had nowhere to go.
After decades of outsmarting the law, Massino is in a corner. The fate of an entire generation of the American Mafia turns on what Massino does next. For decades, Joe Massino had meted out savage punishments, even death, to anyone who broke the Mafia's unbreakable code of omerta. Now, facing death himself, Massino does something no one was expecting. He flips.
It was the first time an official boss of the New York Five families cooperated with the federal government. It was unprecedented.
Out of options, Massino does exactly what so many before him had done.
You had other acting bosses decide to become witnesses. You had other gangsters decide to become witnesses. But this was the first official boss of one of the five families deciding to cooperate. That was the big deal. In the history of the Mafia, it's one of the biggest deals.
The mere fact that he was willing to talk to law enforcement was a complete shock to me.
That was quintessentially Joe Massino. Massino was always about making the smart move and ensuring his survival.
In exchange for evading the death penalty, Massino pleads guilty to the murder of Siaccia, hands the feds $10 million, but most importantly, he tells them everything. He decides if he's going down, they all are.
He became the consummate rat. He gave up everybody to save his own skin. It was a devastating blow. I mean, he turned out to be the worst kind of all. Not just a blabber, but a complete traitor.
This really was a milestone in the government's fight against organized crime.
It changed everything. It seemed that anything was possible, that really anybody could turn, and that no one could be trusted.
Massino's cooperation with the federal government leads to 15 indictments against fellow mobsters.
When it came down to the end, he became the destroyer, the great destroyer. He undid everything that he had created over 20 years. To save his own skin, he was willing to give up everybody else in the family. He had no mercy for anyone else.
With Massino's demise comes the end of the old guard.
You got to realize he was one of the old school, the last of the old school.
But despite his downfall, like a hydra, the Mafia never really dies. It simply grows another head.
The Bonanno family is still alive, still functioning, and is reinventing itself. It's easy to say we've killed them all, we've knocked them all, we've prosecuted them all, but somehow the Mafia continues to thrive. So they've been hurt, but not fatally. It's waiting in the wings to come back as powerfully as it once was.